The year was 1867, in the wind-swept village of Mill Isle, County Down, Ireland. The air smelled of sea salt and damp stone, the waves crashing not far from the Carmichael family home. Inside a modest house lit by flickering lamplight, a newborn girl cried out for the first time. Her parents named her Amy Beatrice Carmichael. No one in that quiet village could have guessed how far her footsteps would travel or how many lives her heart would touch. Amy grew up the eldest of 7 children in a family both devout and disciplined. Her father, David, was a flour miller, a hard-working man, stern but tender toward his family. Her mother, Catherine, carried an unshakable faith, weaving prayer into every part of daily life. Catherine's voice in prayer was often the last sound Amy heard at night, and the first she heard at dawn. Yet even in this godly home, Amy's spirit wrestled with its own questions. She was not a fragile child. She climbed trees, splashed through puddles, and returned home with muddy skirts. She loved stories, music, and the vibrant sights of Ireland. But beneath the surface, she longed for something deeper, something she could not yet name. One small memory, however, stayed with her all her life. As a little girl, she grew fascinated with the idea of missionaries. She heard of men and women who lived among foreign peoples, dressing like them, speaking their languages. One detail burned into her imagination. Many of these people had brown eyes. Amy's eyes were a piercing blue. So she began to pray every night with childlike faith, "Lord, please make my eyes brown." She ran to the mirror each morning expecting the miracle, but her eyes never changed. Years later, she would look back on that childish prayer and say, "It was the first time I realized God's no is as loving as his yes." She would learn that the very eyes she wanted to change would one day serve his purposes. Her world shifted when tragedy struck. Amy's father's business began to fail. The family, once stable, found themselves slipping into financial struggle. The stress weighed heavily on David Carmichael, and not long after, he died, leaving Catherine to care for the children alone. Amy was still young, but her innocence was pierced. Loss and hardship taught her that life was fragile, unpredictable, and filled with sorrow. It also taught her to lean on God more deeply. She would later say that her mother's unwavering prayer during those dark days shaped her understanding of trust more than any sermon. By her late teens, Amy had moved with her family to Belfast. The industrial city was full of noise and smoke, factory chimneys blotting out the sky. Amy noticed things others ignored, especially the poor women and children working long hours in the mills. They were called shawlies because they were too poor to buy hats for church and instead covered their heads with shawls. In many congregations, these women were despised, treated as outcasts. One Sunday morning, as Amy left church, she saw an old woman bent beneath a heavy load. Without hesitation, Amy and her brothers rushed to help her. The act of kindness did not go unnoticed. A group of well-dressed church girls nearby sneered at Amy, mocking her for soiling her gloves with a beggar's dirt. The sting of their words cut deep. As she walked home, her heart heavy, a voice seemed to whisper to her, "Gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, stubble. What are you building with your life?" The question burned inside her, reshaping her vision. Amy began to gather the shawlies into Bible studies. She rented a small room, lit a fire, and welcomed them in. At first, just a handful came, then dozens. Soon the room overflowed, with young women eager to hear her read scripture, sing hymns, and pray. She treated them not as outcasts, but as sisters. Out of this grew a mission hall that welcomed hundreds, factory girls who would never have been welcomed in the respectable pews of Belfast. But Amy's body betrayed her zeal. She suffered from neuralgia, a painful condition that left her exhausted and bedridden for days at a time. During these spells, she wept, asking God why he gave her a heart to serve but a body so weak. In those long nights, verses from Corinthians became her lifeline. "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." She clung to those words with trembling fingers, and slowly her weakness became a place of intimacy with God. Her vision was sharpened further when she encountered the Keswick movement, a revival that swept through England and Ireland, emphasizing holiness, surrender, and absolute trust in God's Spirit. At a Keswick convention, Amy heard a message that pierced her soul. The Christian life is not your strength offered to God, but God's strength poured through you. Kneeling in prayer, she surrendered everything: her health, her future, her comfort. She whispered, "Yes, Lord, anything, anywhere." That vow would shape the rest of her life. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. In 1993, Amy sailed for Japan, eager to pour her life into foreign missions. She landed in Yokohama with a burning heart, but the reality was harsher than she imagined. The language was a fortress she could not scale. The culture was overwhelming. Worse yet, her fragile health collapsed under the strain. Fevers racked her body, leaving her weak and disheartened. After just 15 months, she returned to England in disappointment, convinced for a moment that she had failed. Yet even in that setback, God was at work. Amy wrote later, "God's refusals are His mercies." Her time in Japan had not been wasted. It had tested her resolve, stripped her pride, and prepared her for what was to come. 2 years later, in 1895, an invitation came from India. Amy boarded a ship once more, this time determined not to look back. The journey took weeks, the endless sea rolling beneath her, the horizon unbroken. She prayed constantly on that voyage, asking for courage, for strength, for clarity. When the coastline of South India finally appeared, a land of red earth, palm trees, and temple spires, Amy stepped ashore, never realizing she would never again return to Ireland. And so began the chapter of her life that would change history. The ship had barely left her sight when Amy Carmichael found herself swallowed by the sheer strangeness of India. The sun blazed mercilessly overhead, the air thick and heavy, carrying scents of spices, dust, and burning oil lamps. Rickshaws rattled down the streets, cows wandered lazily, and cries of merchants selling fruit and cloth filled the air. Amy, standing in her plain sari, with her hair covered, felt a mixture of awe and burden. She had chosen not to dress as a Westerner. Instead, she wrapped herself in Indian cloth, darkened her skin with coffee, and lived as close as possible to those she came to serve. Some foreigners disapproved. They thought it beneath the missionary's dignity to so fully adopt the customs of the land. But Amy saw it differently. "If we are to win them," she said, "we must be willing to become one with them." Her first work was simple, moving from village to village with her Indian sisters, praying with women, gathering children beneath the shade of trees to sing and hear scripture, sharing Christ house by house. Life was uncomfortable. She often slept on mats in huts thick with smoke from clay stoves. Mosquitoes tormented her. Her frail health constantly tested her strength. Yet she pressed on, driven not by comfort, but by conviction. It was during these travels that she began to hear whispers of something far darker than she had ever encountered. At first, they were vague, almost unbelievable stories of little girls given to temples, children married to the gods. Villagers avoided speaking openly about it for fear of shame or reprisal, but the whispers would not leave Amy's ears. The truth came to her one day in flesh and blood. A child named Prina, no more than 7 years old, appeared of her side. She was thin, trembling, her eyes filled with terror. She had fled barefoot from a temple, lashes marking her small body. Between sobs, she begged, "Please, Amma, don't send me back." In that moment, Amy made a choice. She wrapped the girl in her sari, held her close, and whispered, "You are safe now." It was an act that changed everything.
Prina's rescue drew fury. Priests demanded her return. Accusations flew. Amy was called a thief, a foreigner meddling in things she did not understand. Crowds jeered at her in the street. On some days, stones were thrown. Yet Amy would not yield. She knew she had seen the face of evil, and she could not close her eyes again. Soon, more children came. Some were smuggled out at night, carried in baskets or hidden under cloths. Others were brought by desperate mothers who whispered at Amy's door, "Take her, please. If she stays, she will be lost." Each child bore invisible scars: fear, shame, confusion. Amy listened to their stories, kissed their tears, and prayed over them. They began to call her Amma, which means mother. What began with one child became dozens, and dozens grew into hundreds. Amy realized she could no longer treat this as scattered rescues. There needed to be a permanent refuge. Together with a band of Indian women devoted to Christ, she began building what became known as the Dohnavur Fellowship. At first, it was little more than palm leaf shelters and mud brick houses. Mats on the ground served as beds. Meals were simple: rice, lentils, whatever they could find. But there was something in the air no temple had ever known: freedom, joy, and the presence of Christ. The children sang in Tamil, their voices lifting like incense. They prayed aloud, tiny voices mingling with the songs of birds at dawn. Amy refused to let the fellowship become a cold institution. She insisted, "We are a family." She wanted every child to know they were not abandoned, not second class, not cursed, but beloved. She told them, "You are God's precious jewels, His treasure." The fellowship grew into a community. Indian women joined Amy as sisters, wearing white saris as a sign of purity and service. They became mothers, teachers, and nurses to the children. Together, they formed a new kind of family, not by blood, but by love. But the path was never easy. Funding was scarce. There were days when there was little food. She would gather the sisters and children to pray, and again, provision arrived at the last moment. A parcel from abroad, a gift from an unknown friend, a bag of rice left at the gate. She lived by a principle she never tired of repeating: God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. Her health remained fragile. Fever often racked her body. Neuralgia struck suddenly, leaving her in searing pain. Malaria sapped her strength. Friends urged her to return home to recover, but Amy would not abandon the children. She said, "If the love of God has set your heart on fire, you cannot stay still." Her ministry soon caught the attention of the outside world. She wrote vividly of India's spiritual darkness in books like Things as They Are. Her words shocked many Western readers. They wanted romantic tales of exotic lands. Amy gave them raw truth of idols, poverty, and children sold into bondage. It was not the story they wanted, but it was the story God compelled her to tell. Opposition never ceased. In 1912, Amy was dragged into court on charges of kidnapping. The atmosphere was tense. Priests accused her fiercely. Officials eyed her with suspicion. But then, one by one, children from Dohnavur stood to testify. They told the court what they had endured in the temples and what they had found with Amma. Their words broke through the lies. Amy was acquitted, and the fellowship was vindicated. The work continued to expand. Schools were built so the children could read and write. A hospital rose to care for their wounds and illnesses. Gardens provided food. Slowly, Dohnavur became a village of light in a land shadowed by darkness. Visitors who came expecting an orphanage were astonished to find instead a family alive with laughter, song, and worship. Amy reminded the children daily that their worth was not measured by their past or by society's scorn,
but by the cross of Christ. She told them, "You are not forgotten, you are not forsaken, you are His." Year after year, the fellowship thrived. Girls who had once been outcasts grew into confident women of faith. Some became nurses or teachers. Others dedicated themselves to the fellowship itself, raising the next generation. Boys found shelter too, learning trades and scripture side by side. The laughter of children rang through courtyards once filled with silence and fear. Amy herself remained in the background. She refused to let her picture be published, believing fame belonged only to Christ. She would not allow her name to overshadow the work. "The work is His, not mine," she insisted. "If it succeeds, it is His. If it fails, it is His." And so the years rolled on. Through danger, illness, and relentless need, the fellowship grew, a testimony not to Amy's strength, but to God's faithfulness. But another test was coming, one that would confine Amy for the rest of her life, and yet, in God's strange design, would widen her influence further than she ever dreamed. It was 1931, and the fellowship had grown into a vibrant community. Children's voices echoed through the courtyards, hymns drifted across the gardens, and the white saris of the sisters moved like streams of light among the homes. Amy, now in her 60s, walked slowly across the compound one morning. She had weathered years of illness and strain, but her spirit was still determined, her steps steady. Then suddenly she stumbled. The fall was sharp, the pain immediate. Her hip was badly fractured. For days she could not move without agony. Weeks turned to months, and it became clear Amy would never walk normally again. She was confined to her small room, her ministry of movement suddenly reduced to a bed and a desk. For someone who had lived in ceaseless action, it might have seemed like the end, but Amy did not see it that way. She believed God wastes nothing, not even suffering. She once wrote, "A cup brimful of sweet water cannot spill even one drop of bitter water, however suddenly jolted." If her life was to be jolted, she wanted only Christ to spill out. Her room became her mission field. It was simple. Whitewashed walls, a narrow bed, a small desk littered with books, pens, and letters. Children tiptoed in daily, climbing onto her bed, eager to hear their Amma tell them stories of Jesus. She prayed with them, laughed with them, sometimes wept with them. Though her body was broken, her love had not dimmed. From that room flowed rivers of words. Amy began to write more than ever. Books like Rose from Briar, Edges of His Ways, and Gold Cord were born in her confinement. She poured out poems, letters, meditations, words of comfort for the weary, strength for the weak, courage for the fearful. They reached across oceans, into homes and churches, into the hands of missionaries and ordinary believers alike. Many who never met her in person found in her writing a companion in their own trials. Her influence grew even as her body shrank. Missionaries in Africa, Asia, and Europe drew courage from her words. Men and women burdened with suffering found in her testimony a reminder that Christ is enough. Still, the nights were long. Often, pain kept her from sleep. She confessed that sometimes the darkness pressed so close she could scarcely breathe. Yet in those moments she whispered again and again, "Jesus, hold me fast." The very nearness of God became her sustenance. The fellowship continued to flourish. Children grew into adults, many dedicating their lives to serving others. Schools expanded, hospitals served the sick, and the family Amy had dreamed of became a reality. She remained its spiritual mother, guiding decisions from her bed, praying over every need, blessing every new life that came through the gates. By the late 1940s, Amy's hair was white, her body frail, but her eyes still burned with the same fire that had carried her from Ireland decades earlier. Visitors who entered her room often remarked on the peace that seemed to radiate there, as if suffering had been transfigured into light. On January 18, 1951, at the age of 83, Amy Carmichael breathed her last. She slipped quietly into the presence of the one she had loved so fiercely. At her request, no stone was placed over her grave. She wanted no monument, no carved words to glorify her name. Instead, the children she had rescued placed a simple birdbath over the spot, carved with one word: Amma. That was enough, for in that word was her legacy: mother, not only to hundreds of children, but to generations of believers who looked to her life as a testimony of God's unrelenting love. The Dohnavur Fellowship lives on to this day. What began with one trembling child has become a sanctuary for countless others, a place of light where once was only darkness. Her books continued to speak, her poems continued to comfort, and her story continues to challenge every believer who hears it. Friend, Amy Carmichael's life is not a tale of human greatness. It is the story of God's strength in weakness. She was frail, often sick, sometimes discouraged, yet she gave her yes to God, once as a young girl, again as a teenager mocked for helping the poor, again when she embraced a terrified child at her door, and again when she lay broken in her bed for 20 years. Each yes became a thread in the tapestry of God's redeeming work. Her story asks us a question: what is God asking of you? Where is He calling you to surrender? What child, what soul, what broken person might be waiting for your yes? You may feel weak, you may feel unseen, but the same God who took a girl from a small Irish village and used her to rescue children and write words that still breathe life today, that same God holds your story too. His grace is sufficient. His strength is made perfect in weakness. So let Amy's life be more than history to you. Let it be an invitation. Whisper, as she once did, "Yes, Lord, anything, anywhere," and then watch what He will do. If this story has stirred your heart, I invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe for more stories of faith that will inspire and challenge you. Together, let us keep these testimonies alive, not to glorify people, but to glorify the God who still writes His story through surrendered lives.